Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome. It's wonderful to see all the steady stream of participants coming in. And I have to go over some housekeeping sort of rules. So I'll get started and hope that we'll have lots of people here by the time we actually kick off this, the heart of this webinar. My name is Yamini Atmavilas, and it gives me great pleasure to invite you and welcome you on behalf of DASRA and the Women Lead India Alliance to this webinar, An Unbalanced Scale, a Practitioner's Lens on Enabling Women's Leadership Through Organizational Change. As people sign in, let me just go over a couple of house rules that will also be available on the chat. We are recording and live streaming this webinar, and we'll have the recording available later through our Women Lead India Alliance page, as well as the DASRA YouTube channel. We are keeping participant microphones off. Apologies for that, in case you feel muted and voiceless. But we do want to get the most out of our panelists' wisdom and conversations. So we do encourage you to please join our LinkedIn page, and Anamika has posted the link on the chat. Please post your comments and questions there, and one of us will try to answer some of those questions in real time. The idea is really that we collate a lot of your questions and use that for our own conversations. And we'll also have the panelists, perhaps at a later point in time, go ahead and respond to you and interact with you on the Alliance page. We do have captions available for the webinar in case anyone needs them. For any questions or any other sort of concerns, please connect with the host of the webinar or tag Anamika on the chat. I'd like to begin with a little bit of an introduction to gender equity at DASRA. Gender equity has been an integral part of DASRA's work over the last 25 years. And this includes a lot of our well-known work with adolescent girls, our work with informal women workers, as well as women's participation in local governance. As an organization as well, DASRA has a cross-cutting lens of gender equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI as we call it internally, built in across initiatives to ensure representation in both who we are as well as what we do. More recently, DASRA launched the Gender Equity and Women's Leadership Initiative, believing that women and girls leadership can serve as a real accelerator to foster gender equity and transformative action and policies at organizational as well as ecosystem levels. This initiative seeks to catalyze women and girls leadership across business, philanthropy, and the development sector through 3 or 4 prongs that DASRA is well sort of known for: evidence building, narrative change, and collaborative action. To support the ambition and growing salience for women's leadership, DASRA catalyzed the launch of the Women Lead India Alliance in 2024. I'll now hand over to my colleague Gauri Sangi, who with her team is actively shaping this alliance, to share a little bit about the alliance and what it's about. Over to you, Gauri.
Thanks, Yamini. Good afternoon, everyone. Really nice to see all of you here. So as Yamini was saying, I think taking forward the work that DASRA has been doing in the space of gender equity, earlier this year, we launched the Women Lead India Alliance. It's a cross-sector, multi-stakeholder platform that brings together networks, organizations, practitioners, all working towards advancing women and girls leadership. Our aim is to integrate work across business, philanthropy, and development sector, because we feel there's a lot that one can learn from these sectors. We also feel, given where DASRA is placed and our position in the sector, bringing different players together from these sectors will add to that conversation. Our aim with the Alliance is to reach out to 10 million women and girls across the country. And we want to do this by, one, channelizing better and improved resources for gender equity work and specifically women in leadership work, thinking about what are sustainable mechanisms to continue resourcing, thinking about how to influence more investment across these sectors for more women in leadership. We want to create a strong knowledge base, really bring to the sector what works, what doesn't work, invest time looking at what are some models that we want to test out, what can one learn from something, what are some failures that we also want to document and inform how the sector moves forward. And the third piece is really what we are trying to do today, which is bringing different players who are doing great work in this space together, create a space for collaboration, align on agendas, and see how we can, create space for collective action for something like this. I think in the future, there will be many more opportunities as today where we want to curate platforms which are specific to sectors which are cross-sectoral, one such platform being today. Yeah, very excited to be here listening to all of you. Extremely excited to, hear all our panelists. If you want to know more about the Alliance, please write to us and join the LinkedIn Alliance page. We have put the link already on chat, and happy to connect with all of you and see how all of you can also in the Alliance. Over to Yamini.
Great. Thanks, Gauri. And to everyone just joining, welcome again. Welcome to this webinar, An Unbalanced Scale, a practitioner's lens on enabling women's leadership through organizational change. This webinar is part of a series of research and learning dialogues we are curating to really understand what drives women's leadership within specific sectors, as well as a broader national sort of landscape. One of our use cases in this initiative is healthcare, and we've been really trying to understand what the drivers of women's leadership are within the sector. I'm personally very excited to have 4 women who I'm a fan of and who can really help us open up the black box of organizational change towards more women in leadership. It's my pleasure to introduce Charlotta before I hand it off to her. Charlotta is currently a partner at Red Associates. She's focused on driving social impact and spearheading change management strategies at some of the world's largest foundations and corporations. Her work and recent writing explores innovative ways to apply social science theory to business problems. In her past, Charlotta has driven programs on poverty alleviations and economic development with the United Nations Development Program in Cairo and Algiers. She's worked with the Danish government and with the International Center for Corporate Accountability. Thank you so much, Charlotta. You're a co-conspirator in this entire endeavor with us, and I'm so excited to see what the next hour and a half brings us. With my thanks to you and to the panelists, I hand over to Charlotta.
Thank you very much, Yamini. And thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for hosting this webinar. It's a great opportunities both to bring together the panelists that I will be introducing in a second, but also to meet, or at least to be able, from my perspective, to talk to such a great group of people that I can see that are checking in, flowing into the webinar, which is excellent. Of course, I wish that I could see you all and actually live get feedback and thoughts, because I think, of course, we will do our best in the panel to say something that I hope you'll find interesting and relevant. But reality is that the experiences and the knowledge that the rest of the participants in this webinar have is probably as valuable, maybe even more. But we won't be able to share that in this moment. Hopefully, you will want to share thoughts and reflections, as Yamini was just suggesting, either during the webinar or after on the web page. That would just be a great outcome, one outcome of this session. Otherwise, I've been wondering, how do we get this started? Because it's women in leadership in healthcare. What does that even mean? There's so many angles to this question. But I guess for me personally, the reason why it's particularly important, this topic of women in leadership in healthcare, is because not only you can have a moral position and say, not only is it not fair that there are not more women in leadership in healthcare, and I think that is a very valid point, that it doesn't feel right. But there is also another reason why it really matters to change this, which is that when you have women in leadership, results improve. And as we have healthcare, the hospitals, our home care services, our doctors, the big bulk of the patients they treat are women and their children. And it seems a mistake when not more women are part of designing what kind of treatment should women and children and men, obviously, have, what kind of prioritization should be made in hospitals, of where should the money be used, what kind of research and development should be prioritized, how should clinical trials be designed, and I could go on and on and on. It seems a mistake not to have women much more at the center of these decisions, because these decisions matter for the treatments that we get and that our children get. And when we have women in that room making those decisions tend to become more equitable, and they tend to become better for women and children. So that's at least why, from my perspective, I think this is an extremely important topic. And I also believe that I share this perspective with my fellow panelists. And that's why we are trying to push this field forward today. And I mean, it's not done in 1.5 hours, unfortunately. So today in this webinar, but as our work continues. And this is probably a good segue to introducing my fabulous panelists that I don't know. I was trying to calculate how many years of experience is in this room. Many. Each of my fellow panelists have plus 20 years of experience in their field, and have contributed in various ways to the pursuit of not just women in leadership, but also to the wider DEI agenda, as practitioners in companies, as writers, as both as more on the scholar side, writing sort of more academically leaning work, but also as journalists, contributing more to the debate and the way that society forms an opinion about DEI, what works, and women in leadership. And it's such a pleasure to introduce each of you. And I will apologize. You can hear my accent. I'm from a different place. So I'll do my best to say my fellow panelists' names and other names that I'm not that familiar with, but I may make mistakes. So please, I ask for your forgiveness upfront. But let me introduce Shreyashi Singh, Aparajita Agrawal, and Shubhashri Naldurg, that are all three here to join me. And maybe I should start with you, Shreyashi. I look forward to doing more work together. When I hear about you and the work you're doing, it's extremely impressive. So what should I mention? I could, there's a long bio for each of the three of you. So let me just do what I found most sort of, okay, here we are. So Shreyashi, you founded Harappa, and you're also currently the CEO of Harappa. which is fantastic. But you're also president of brand capability and delivery at Upgrad Enterprise. And you have done a bunch of different stuff throughout your career, working on entrepreneurship, journalism, teaching as well over the more than 20 years that you've been engaged in this field. You've written a few books. You're a columnist. You are engaged in the AI agenda that we're not going to talk about that much today. But in my long list of things where it really matters, that you get a female, a women's perspective and a gender perspective. The way that AI is changing decision making is maybe the one elephant in the room that we won't be talking that much about, but that truly matters. And maybe you will not be able to help yourself, Shreyashi, and then I'll be very happy to hear that perspective too. But that's Shreyashi Singh. Thank you very much for joining us. And then there is Aparajita Agrawal. And Aparajita, I'll be trying to say your name well. I probably already butchered it, so I'm so sorry for that. But Aparajita comes with massive experience as well to this field, both working in India, but also being part of a global group that works across particularly the global south, but really with a global perspective. You're the director of development and strategic partnerships at Value for Women, and you're basically promoting women's participation and leadership throughout the world. Your contributions to the field, I think, and this also talks to the nice mix that we have here today, that you have been deeply involved in measuring and understanding impact investments and how they shape the field. And then you have just a vast working experience, not just from Value for Women, but also from the British Asian Trust and Care India and so forth. So thank you very much for being here today. And finally, but not least, Shubhashri Nadurg, who is currently head of women in leadership in Interweave Consulting. When I was diving into your bio a little bit, I couldn't help thinking that from my perspective, it's sort of a dream panel because you represent that focus on how we as individuals in organizations think about ourselves, how our fellow colleagues think about ourselves, what that means for the actions we take, but also the opportunities we give. Shubhashri comes with, again, plus 20 years of experience, in this case, working in learning and development. You have worked with global firms such as the Lehman Brothers, Nomura, L&T, as a consultant, pushing their work forward when they measure and coach, I guess, women and men to work in a more inclusive way, and also to find their own place in the workforce, which is something we're going to return to today. So, dear webinar participants, as you can hear, it's a fantastic team. So don't hesitate if you have any comments and reflections as the conversation rolls on. Chip in on the platform, and we will try to get back to and continue the discussion after this session. Now, I thought ideally I would have everyone's picture up on the screen, which is not possible, or it would be a mess. So we will not do that, but I will ask you to please, there's going to be a little poll come up, and I would love to hear at least just what industries you're representing. So let's just run the poll. I hope it will be very intuitive what to do. So let's do question number 1, please. And please ask your question or please answer. So we can see, thank you. I can see everybody's participating. Thank you. You never know with these beautiful things whether they will work. So I can see there's a lot of other, oh no, what does that mean? We don't know. But there's also gender experts, diverse DEI experts. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And I will want to dig into the other, but maybe we can do that on our platform. And let's just give the last stragglers a few seconds more to contribute their answer. Great. Thank you very much. And then I would love to just get the discussion started with a question to all of you out on that are participating in the webinar. If we could move to question number 2. So basically, as we'll be discussing women in leadership today and what is currently going on, I would love to hear your answer to the question how effective the current DI solutions are in terms of accelerating women's rise to healthcare leadership. I will give you a few more seconds. Thank you very much. So it's of course always important to know whether we are starting in the same place for a discussion like this. And I can see that some think believe that the root problems are actually very clear and the effective solutions to get to tangible results also exist. And I assume that you then also would say that the big challenge is implementation. It's basically to get on with the work. And we will certainly be discussing in our panel today what that could mean. How do we get on with it? How do we know when an organization is ready for change? And how do we get, I guess you could say, build allyship within organizations to push this change? Then we have a lot of participants that are answering that the problem needs to be investigated deeper within the organizations and solutions need experimenting. 60% of you answer that, which is certainly also part of the work that I know my panelists are involved in, is to figure out what does actually work and what kind of solutions work best in different contexts. And then there is 30% of you that answer that the solutions or the problems are somewhat clear, but that the solutions require some customization. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think that's a good segue to basically talk a little bit about what's going on in the industry. And Sriyashi, I would like to maybe ask you to kick us off here. Because I know that you have not just done a lot of writing in the space, but in Hapara, you have also done quite a lot of research on the state of affairs, so to speak. So Sriyashi, from your perspective, when you look at the different organizations you're working with, but also that you have surveyed, Oops, and now the question comes up again. What do you see as the different ways that organizations try to unlock pathways for women in leadership?
Thanks, Charlotte, and thank you to, of course, Gauri and Yamini for having us, and wonderful to be here. Looking forward. Over the last 2 years, in my role as sort of founder of Harappa, which is an enterprise learning company, where we set up what we call the School for Women and the School for Diversity as part of sort of a larger offerings for enterprise learning, and now also at Enterprise. One of the advantages that we've had is we work with 800 plus to current research on Indian workplaces, because that is one of the things, of course, that we saw, that there just wasn't enough data to understand the problem, right? And I think through that, we've essentially over the last 18 months probably researched the largest number of women professionals in India across segments of industries, and 15-20% of that data also comes from healthcare through these 3 reports that we did: the Women in Workplace report, the What Women Want report, and most recently the What Women Feel report. And the data is encouraging in some ways, very limited, but there's obviously so much for us to fix and do. And they were from a healthcare perspective, if we were to kind of focus on that. The 2 things that really stand out to me is a quote that we got from somebody in healthcare, was to say that it's almost no coincidence that jobs associated with female workers are more poorly compensated and less prestigious. And when men take over those jobs, they become valuable, as it is with chefs, right? So it isn't that women choose jobs that pay less. There's just a lingering prejudice against women jobs as less worthy of good pay. And so the first thing that we found, of course, in across industry, but kind of pronounced in healthcare, was the pay gap. Most upsetting, I mean, some of the data that when we do some of this research, some of the data really angers me. Sometimes, I think it's important for us to be angry at what the situation is. So the data that, pissed me off, honestly, the most, and what I honestly call the unforgivable sin, is the greatest pay gap between male professionals and women professionals was at the CXO and CXO minus 1 stage. And that, there was a 20%, and that to me was really upsetting, that what more does one need to do to have great careers over 20-25 years, through the dint of hard work and against all obstacles, kind of get there, and yet at the place where you had hoped that you would be insulated from any kind of, if not discrimination, but differences, is when you stare at the worst pay gap across levels. So I think that's one thing, and it's true in healthcare as well. That's one thing to certainly focus on. The second was even in the mid career, right? There we've seen there's a 35% pay gap in senior physicians and surgeons, from male physicians and surgeons to women physicians and surgeons. So what we did is, this was self-reported data, that we asked a set of women senior physicians and surgeons to tell us how much they earn. And then we did a control group and asked male physicians and surgeons how much they did. And there is a 35% plus gap, right? I think, the questions of merit and all of that just don't come into question. So I think, those 2 things are, of course, so those 3 problems about prejudices against actually caregiving and nurturing those, being overall less prestigious and being paid less, but most critically, that continuing throughout the tenure of women professionals and women leaders in healthcare, as much as in other industries, is that even in the mid career of super specialized skills as senior physicians or surgeons, as well as on the management side at the CXO and CXO minus 1 levels, just the disparity just continues to exist. So I think that's, something that I wanted to call out on. in terms of what we are seeing, and I'll make these points to stop this, so I can hear from the other co-panelists as well. I call women's careers the greatest obstacle course in history, right? Like, it should not be so tough. It's almost like an Jones-esque kind of adventure that, you're going through deep cliffs with snake pits, you're walking on rickety bridges, you're doing everything, right? You're sort of assaulted by some freak weather incident that might happen. But that is what's true, because when you start plotting what happens to early career, right? The starting jobs, and then what actually happens right till the glass cliff. So there's the first is the broken rung, which happens around the ages of 28 to 35. Then, of course, is the famous and the kind of the glass ceiling. And if even once you come kind of battered and bruised and break the glass ceiling with your forehead bleeding, the new phenomenon, of course, there is the glass cliff, that super senior women leaders are actually leaving the workforce at twice the rate of super senior male professionals. Because I think by then you're just so tired and, like, maybe even disgusted, that you just want to, you just need to take a break. So I think it should not be so tough. Women's path to leadership should not be so tough. And if there's any optimism that I have, is that in our work on the School for Women and School for Diversity with sort of 300-400 companies over the last 4 years, I do see that there is growing understanding that we have to focus on this problem, and which is why we are here, and initiatives like the Women Lead India Alliance exist. So I think the conversations crescendoing is the only optimism, but unfortunately the reality and the data give very little to be optimistic about yet.
Yeah, there is a lot of work to do. Maybe I'll just ask you a follow-up question, and then I would also love to hear from both you, Shubhashri and Aparajita, what in your experience, what you could say the current situation looks like. But I would also love to just I think these problems of pay gaps and I thought it was very interesting. I think the chef example is very easy to understand, and an excellent example of a job that used to be female, poorly paid. When it becomes male, it becomes, or at least a subset of those chefs become extremely prestigious and very well paid, and they are male. So it's a really interesting dynamic that we see in many places. So I think that's fascinating. I wish that we, when we are done today, also have a few pointers to what we can do. So there is something about the massive injustice, the massive problems that we are hammering on. But it would also be interesting to see or hear if you, in your experience, Shreyasi, are there any companies that are doing something that you think it doesn't maybe solve the entire problem, but something is happening? You're saying there's interest, which is already, I would argue, 20 years ago around the world, nobody cared. 10 years ago around the world, some cared. And now there is this growing understanding that this is silly, this is not right, that women are paid less, and so forth. So what are you, from your experience, are there any examples, and what can we potentially learn from them?
So 3 quick suggestions, solutions, and examples kind of combined, right? One is, of course, that we have to, if it is this obstacle course, the fact is that women professionals, and certainly high potential women professionals, if we're taking the leadership lens, need specific interventions at specific cusps in their careers. I think this understanding of cusp, and I think people are doing that. For example, we run programs, for the early to mid career, then the mid career to, the forefront of leadership, and then for super senior women CXOs, right? And I think kind of that laddering approach, we feel like, hey, somebody who's made director or VP doesn't need it. I've actually realized that at the super senior level as well, there has to be specific interventions, because there's specific and unique circumstances and challenges that, women leaders might come up against. So I think that's one thing that we are starting to see people appreciate, our enterprise and talent custodians appreciate, is this kind of continuous journey and ladder. The second and the third are more solutions that you ask from. Is, did your research show anything that could be a what we can do, right? And I think the what we can do for me are two simple things that constantly comes up, from the women professionals. We praise them publicly. I think this lack of public recognition, like I think women professionals just crave recognition. There's just like a crisis and kind of a drought of recognition that women have at home and at work. So, make it a point to just like really design reward schemes that go to public recognition. You don't need to write emails with ceasing people, whatever it is. Let's just be much more magnanimous and generous with the praise, because women professionals are crying for it. And the last thing that I'd say, we saw a huge correlation between women in their mid-career, right, having PNL roles as kind of starting to see at the pathway to true leadership, right? And I think those who had PNL roles, also the wage gap was less at the super senior. So one of the things that I always try and encourage any women professional at home or at work in my charge is you don't have to do sales all your life, right? You don't have to manage PNL all your life, but you need a 3-year stint in your CV where there is PNL management, right? And I think as talent custodians, people, it's just to ensure that we get as many women professionals, especially in their mid-careers, right? Where trajectories start to change, where either you can stay horizontal or go vertical, is push them to have PNL roles. It's probably the strongest correlation that we have seen as a predictor of sort of, continued leadership.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Before we move on, I would love to hear from you, Aparajita, because you have that more global view, whether these issues that we see here with pay gap and role, nearly like a gendered role definition, I guess, and the trajectory, when the biggest problems, or when you have the drop-offs, do you see that also more globally? And any thoughts about that?
Thanks, Charlotte, and thank you, Women Lead Alliance, for bringing me here. I agree with everything Shreyasi said, and I think a lot of what Shreyasi was saying was sort of hitting home, right? And when I was prepping for this panel, my 3 sort of keywords are around the challenges that I think we see as, my organization as Value for Women, and me as a practitioner. What the 3 big things that I see is the underrepresentation that Shreyasi talked about. We have a lot of women doctors or female doctors in India, but that number is still very small. I think the last report that I'd seen was somewhere around 17%. Maybe it's gone up a bit, but it's still pretty low compared to what it should be. And the representation in leadership position is significantly lower, as Shreyasi was also saying. The second point that I would say is that pay disparity that you brought up, Shreyasi, and I think that's not just for the healthcare sector. I mean, that ails the entire sort of globally. We see that as a big challenge, but I think in India specifically, that's more acute. The healthcare space in India, I think the data points that I had at my end were they earn 28 to 30% less. Women workforce in the healthcare space are getting 28 to 30% less on an average, and that's not even counting. I mean, this is an average out rate, given that more and more women that we are seeing moving in leadership position or in healthcare spaces are probably going into the private sector. But if you look at the overall sector, there is a massive pay disparity, and that's not just on account of sort of what the hospitals or pharmaceutical companies themselves might be paying, but there's a big structural challenge around it, made further sort of complicit with societal norms and traditional sort of gender roles. And the third point for me that I would also put forward is the leadership roles or the gaps that we see, which is, again, in terms of what kind of leadership roles do organizations feel more comfortable with putting women in. And And where does it start? Where does that glass ceiling and the glass cliff that Shreyasi were talking about starts coming into play? And oftentimes we see women themselves starting to opt out at certain points because of the life cycle challenges that they're facing, or the societal norms, or that they need to be more around for care responsibilities, for the children, for the parents, for their families, and so on. And I think one of the big takeaways for me has been that no matter how much, like, there is obviously a lot that can be done at an institutional level, there is a large structural challenge at play here. And that large structural challenge is not just with the industry or with specific individual organizations, but it also comes at play at the kind of laws, the policies, the regulations that we are subjecting and we are demanding better outputs towards from each of these organizations. So I think in all, it's a bleak picture, but I think it's only, I think the good part to think about here is, or if I have to look at the glass being half full, is that the only way to go from here is get better, go up. And so I think we have all of us here in this panel, as well as the audience that we have today, has a big role to play, and continue to sort of call out and share examples and experiences of what we can do better.
Thank you. Shubhashri, do you have anything to add here?
Yes, sure.
Mhm.
Thanks,
Yes.
Yamini and Gauri, for giving me an opportunity to be here this morning. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation, and some great conversations have already started, and I'd really like to add, something to that. So I come from Interweave Consulting, and we've been in this space for the last 17 plus years. And we do a lot of work with women leaders across corporates in India. So we've worked with 150 plus clients over the last 8 years. And one of the things that we also do is we do a survey with women leaders to understand what some of their top challenges are. And I think adding to what Shreyasi and Aparajita have already spoken, I think I just want to make a couple of points. I think one of the key things that come up is the unconscious gender bias that women leaders face at the workplace. And we did a survey with about 900 plus women, and 39% of them said that they were facing unconscious gender bias at the workplace, and this was across 16 organizations in India, and mostly women at middle management. So that's a very large percentage which feel that becomes a barrier for their growth in organizations. And some of the common ones that came up, I think a very key one was maternal bias, where there is a feeling that a mother cannot be a good employee. And that's where we see a lot of women at middle management struggling to rise, because while they have aspirations, there is the willingness to take on more responsibilities. There is that benevolent sexism which feels that she's a working mother, let's give her lighter responsibilities. She won't be able to travel, let's not put her in a challenging role. She can't go to critical sites, and then it becomes a slippery slope where you have fewer and fewer opportunities for those really plumb complex roles which can get you into the CXO level. And this is a major challenge for a lot of women. They talk about it. Another one that comes across is the performance bias, where women have to work much harder to prove that they are as good as their male counterparts, or to prove that they are making a contribution that's valuable to the organization. So they're held to much stricter standards. And a lot of women leaders tell us that when they're in a minority, they feel scrutinized. They feel that there is already an expectation that they are going to not do as well as their male colleagues. So and also the pressure of having to be a role model for other women, where they're many times in the spotlight. So that becomes the environment itself is many times not as enabling as they would like. And the last one that I'd like to talk about here from an unconscious gender bias perspective is the likability bias. So, for a long time, organizations have not encouraged gender diverse leadership. So you have these leadership competency frameworks, which mostly have masculine attributes, or there is a feeling that a certain kind of leader will be successful in our environment. So what happens is then, minority groups don't have the environment which allows for authentic expression. And in a sense, you're not really encouraging different kinds of leadership, gender leadership, gender diverse leadership in the organization. And women face this challenge of, can I be liked or can I be respected, which is called the double bind, where if they are feminine, they're liked because that's the gender role expectation that we expect from them in the society and the workplace. But then they're not respected because they're not being effective leaders. So these were some of the key barriers that women themselves have expressed. And I think I just wanted to add this perspective to what has already been shared.
Brilliant. I can totally see that, and I think it's coming into this discussion. I thought, what do I have to say here? It's about healthcare, women in leadership in India, and I sit here with my completely different background and so on and so on. But what is really interesting about these issues is that these are not local or regional. They are global. And for example, all of the different components of the different types of barriers that have been mentioned, I can just, from my experience coming from a very different place, not to. I recognize them. They are there. It's a global issue. The extent to which each of these dimensions matter more or less and so forth, and what can be done about it, of course, varies a lot. And I think there's something very interesting about what can work in the specific context that we are also discussing today, because these issues are worthwhile fighting down to the I think it's brilliantly articulated, this tension between being liked and being respected. Maybe sometimes choice that women feel they have to make. So thank you very much for that. I would love to hear a little bit from our audience. So sorry, you will get another poll question. Please, we have the next question. Fingers crossed that it works. Is something maybe happening? Could we have the next poll question? And if not, I'm not going to torture myself, nor you, by waiting more than a few more seconds. Here we go. So we would love to hear from your perspective out in the audience, from your experience, what are the biggest barriers to increasing representation of women in healthcare leadership? Lack of commitment, belief that gender transformation is too expensive, yeah. Need for more time and investment to build effective solutions. And I think we are there. Thank you very much. So it's interesting to see that you can, not even mathematically inclined person can see it doesn't add up to 100, because of course we're asking you to give multiple answers if you think that's right. And I think that is coming through very clearly here, that it's rarely just one thing. And I think that's also what we've been talking about. There are many factors that contribute to that become barriers to getting more representation of women in healthcare leadership. It's both seen as a leadership commitment problem that, and we will talk more about that for sure, because I think that commitment is, what does commitment mean? And I think it'll be interesting in the work going forward, not in this conversation, but to start thinking about commitment at different levels and understanding where the people that you want to change, where they start, and what kind of commitment can you realistically ask for, or realistically what is pragmatically true so that you can engage people without scaring them away. So what does leadership commitment look like? And when there's a lack, what change can we make to that? Believes that gender transformation is too expensive for leaders in the short term. I'm sure you're right that that becomes a factor, not for all organizations, but certainly for some, that there is a perception they don't see how gender transformation is actually potentially a growth driver, a revenue driver. They see it as a cost and a pain. And then lastly, that there's a need for more time and investment to build these effective solutions. So if we don't know what the solutions are, even if there is commitment, even if there is a belief that it may not actually be a cost driver, it may actually be a revenue driver in the long term, the solutions are still difficult. So there's a lot of work to do. And I'm going to stop sharing here. And do like this. So thank you very much, all of you. And I would love to now dive a little bit more into, so what do we actually know? And Shubhashri, I would like to, I know that you work a lot with leaders and HR leaders in companies, and try to engage them in the work. And we know that, and we have probably all been in that situation where we have drunk the Kool-Aid, you could say, of the company we're working for, and we are proud of the company we're working for. There's a reason why I have chosen to put 10 years of my life in this company. I think it's a company that could be improved, yes, but I'm also proud of it. So in those situations where we have HR leaders, they are proud of their organization. How do we move them? How do you make them imagine? And that's to the cost driver versus revenue driver. How do you make them imagine that there is room for improvement?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. A very interesting question there. And if you look at it, there is tons of research available today about the business case for diversity, inclusion, equity. So I don't think that's something we need to tell HR leaders, and they have enough information on that. So it's not that there isn't an awareness. There is a lot of awareness of the need for a DI strategy mandate, of having women in leadership positions, and so on. So how do we really engage with HR leaders and business leaders? I think it really helps to understand their context well, what they're trying to solve for, what are some of their motivations, what are some of their drivers. If we really have to get them on board to work with us on increasing representation of women at leadership levels. And some of the things that we've found are, one is, they already have some internal pain points that they're looking to solve for. It could be attrition of minority groups. And in fact, there's a BCG research which was done recently in 2023 that showed that employees who experience discrimination or bias or disrespect are 1.4 times more likely to quit their job. So if they are seeing attrition, especially, amongst talented women at middle management, and they were looking to build a leadership pipeline with them and move them into senior positions, and they're leaving, then that becomes an area of concern. And this attrition could be because of workplace culture. It could be because you don't have supporting policies and processes. It could be that the ecosystem is not enabling them, and so on. But they have a pain point there, and they want to plug this leaking pipeline. So a discussion on that helps them to see the need for something like this, and how it's going to benefit them as an organization. The other reason that HR leaders are really looking to engage on conversations around having more women in leadership is many of them are facing talent gaps, some of them significant talent gaps in the industries that they work with, and they really want to have a more diverse leadership team. They want to recruit also from a more diverse pool, and for that they need to have an organization which is seen as more inclusive, that helps them to bring women on board. Many times we also find that the motivation comes from conversations they've had with their key stakeholders. We've had instances where very large organizations, some of their key clients have said, we came into a meeting and how come your entire leadership team is male? We don't see any diversity. And, so then they've gone back and reflected on what did we do wrong? Why don't we have any women in leadership positions? So sometimes it's someone outside calling it out for you, saying that, hey, we don't see the kind of diversity that we would like to see in your organization. And one of the things, Charlotta, that you spoke about right at the beginning, which I think is a key driver, is your customer base. If your customer base is diverse and a large part of the wallet is being controlled by women, or even if your customers are not of a certain diversity dimension, then you need to have an employee base which reflects that, which understands that, for you to have the best kind of solutions. And I think it also comes down to what are your competitors doing in your industry. What are some of their best practices? What is the workplace culture there? Because at the end of the day, you really want to have the best in class talent, which can help your organization outperform your competitors. Talent which can bring you to the cutting edge of innovation and thought leadership. And that won't happen without diverse perspectives. So it's really so many different things that leaders consider when they're thinking about the need for having diverse leadership teams. And it becomes, I think, from our perspective, important to understand. Sometimes they're not even aware that these could be related to the fact that you don't have a gender diverse team. So it becomes important for us to have a conversation with them, understand, and also explain to them what what are some of the challenges that other organizations are trying to solve through an initiative like this. And it helps them to see why they need something like this.
And I guess that leads to the obvious follow-up question, which is what can, and I think Shreyashi, I would love to hear from you, when it comes to bringing that kind of understanding that this is a problem, but here are solutions. What in your experience, what works? I mean, now through Habara, you've been doing research, analyzing the field. Do you have any feedback, or do you know what works in terms of making that shift in awareness, from awareness to, okay, we can actually do something about this?
Yeah. No, actually, what she was saying at Harappa and Upgrade, essentially, we're a learning company. So we also deliver, obviously, a lot of these programs. The research is
Yes.
a way for us to make the programs much more targeted and useful and relevant. I think we appeal to, especially when I'm speaking to a CHRO or a CEO or talent leader, essentially, it's kind of appeal to two things that I genuinely believe in, right? And I think it's a responsibility that organizations, and the privilege I think organizations really have. I feel for most of us in our lives, the employer is our real educator. We come into the workforce at 22, 23, 24, 25, whatever it is, after having done formal education, but we are actually sort of do all our adulting and growing up, and certainly as professionals for 40, 50, 60 year, now we are 60-year careers, right? That many of us will have. So I think that role, so I really appeal to the reader to say that the employer as an educator, like you are really the vice chancellors of the college presidents that matter. And I do think and specifically in the India context, that the societal biases and the reality at home is actually worse in some ways than the reality at the workplace. So I think the employer as the change maker, I think actually, I'm very hopeful that organizations actually have much more leverage and many more levers to bring in change. And I would guess that for many of us, right, even in this call, that actually our workplace is a place of equality, even more than sort of, if not our immediate homes where we've fought for equality, but in extended families and things like that, there are still so many biases. So I think I really appeal at that level. I think the challenges are for getting this done is, there is a lot of data about, hey, of course, when women are on the board, things, whatever. I think at even the macro level data, I think it just kind of glosses over. It's like water off a duck's back on some of the things. The fact that people find it so shocking that the workforce participation for women in India has actually been falling, and that we are, at 127th or whatever it is, right? We just assume in urban pockets of Delhi, Hyderabad, Gurgaon, Pune, whatever, and yet you see, a really small group of women like us, which seems like a crowded group, you feel like the problem is solved, right? And I think actually we're getting worse rather than getting better. I mean, we've done so much for women's education, right? India has done so well on gross involvement ratios, graduate outcomes for women, but in employment and leadership, actually workforce participation is falling. And somehow I still don't feel people appreciate, that this is a strange dichotomy, that as the country is kind of mounting this incredible economic trajectory, uneven and whatever, with all its problems, the fact is that workforce participation for women, especially in urban whatever, is actually falling. I struggle to kind of hit that point and make that point come alive for people. The second is, I think, the language of bias and sort of the this, so, and I appreciate this empathy. I think all of us have fixed our language. I don't think all of us were saying the right things even 3 years back, 5 years back. I know that I cringe at some of the things that I would have lazily said 3 years, 5 years back. But I think there is, it needs that everyday commitment, right, to fix things like language, which can really become very hurtful and stop people in their growth. It's as difficult as, getting the right nutrition regime or the exercise regime. But I think the language of bias, right, like this everyday language of bias that kind of just limits is again sort of, the one thing that one sees that is really. And the last thing is role models. I was watching this fascinating interview, a show, Oprah Winfrey and Elizabeth Gilbert, who's one of my favorite authors, and they were dissecting Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And they said over the last 2,000 years of the hero's journey being enacted by legends, myths, great movie character, they've not one hero's journey has been plotted on a woman, right? I mean, it's Moses and Luke Skywalker and everybody else, but it's never really. There are no women's role. There's no women's hero's journey, right? And I think so. We are lacking 5,000 years. I don't know how many years of lack of women role models, and I think that needs concerted effort to really. So I say, you pick the 3 or 5 women in your company or in your team, and then just, I feel like we have to be personalized and almost surgical in trying to fit this. I think HR leaders want to standardize, which I can understand the impulse of, and cover a lot of people. But my suggestion always is, take 5, take 7 women, and in that 1 year, just kind of, plot a career path for them that becomes sort of, inspiring for others and shows that it is possible with the right ingredients. So I think sort of much more precision interventions, now that we talked about healthcare, I think to me is important, especially at the leadership level.
Khaled, I want to add something there,
please.
and I think great points made by Shreyasi. And I was just reflecting, we keep talking about leadership buying, but one of the challenges that we've come across, or barriers which really needs a shift in organizations, is whether you have enough allies at the people management level, middle management to senior management level, and are you making them accountable to create safe, respectful, and inclusive workplaces? Because a lot of senior leaders get it, and they share their vision, they try to make changes in their own behavior, and they try to express that vision to the larger organization. But if you don't have the rest of the ecosystem getting it, and they don't understand the communication in its true essence, then it just becomes something that leaders are saying but never gets implemented on the ground. So I think that shift is very important, that while leadership buying is an absolute must, I think working on the rest of the ecosystem and making the right communication there is extremely important to bring that shift. Because we work with few organizations where they didn't do that communication, and then what it creates is a sense of insecurity, because the rest of the organization doesn't understand why do you have such a focus on building an inclusive workplace. and it just causes more issues to come in. So I think very, very important for the shift to happen, to take the entire organization along and not just the leadership.
I would love, Aparajita, I know this is something that we have also talked a little bit about, accountability and the role of accountability. I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, I think maybe so there's accountability and there's the leadership commitment we were talking about, right? And I think for that to happen, one of the things that we've seen in our experience at Value for Women, and we've worked with, I would say, I think over 2,000 organizations in the last 10, 11 years, largely in the private sector, and the challenges and the solutions often, I mean, they have to be very context specific, but they often remain the same, right? Like the challenges you're unearthing across organizations, across sectors are not very different. The context may be different, the sectors may be different. And what we see in our work is that, yes, leadership commitment is absolute must, but you also, when as let's say, when as consultants or as solution providers, we are stepping into these organizations and helping them look at their challenges and identify the solutions, it's often a heart and mind debate, right? You need to win both. You need to be able to create, build a rationale, not just for the impact case, but also the business case. Yes, it's great to have women. You should have more women. You should be respectful. You should build a career path, et cetera, et cetera. But it is actually in the organization's benefit. They can see the business case. They can see the ROI. And I think for private sector organizations, it often is a more treacherous path because they have limited resources, they have limited bandwidth, they have big agendas, they have the pressure of demonstrating profitability and ROI to their stakeholders. So the accountability we are talking about is not just towards gender or DEI as an area that they should be doing better on, but on every possible thing that they have taken on board. And I think we often see that if we can go in as enablers, if we can go in without finger wagging at them, without but helping chart out a path that tells them that you can break this into achievable chunks. You can make this could be achievable. You can build in those tiny sort of milestones around the accountability we were talking about, but how do you start weaving targets, goals, KPIs, metrics into the organizational sort of work plan or the organizational KPIs so that this doesn't become a separate agenda or a separate sort of parallel project to run. That works, that often sees organization get those quick wins. If they start seeing those quick wins, the momentum and the commitment and the accountability starts happening. The first few steps are usually the hardest. The leadership commitment backs it if they can see that, well, departments are starting to move forward, they are starting to see changes. Maybe it's a 5% change in the women in the field workforce for women in a specific area, or maybe it is about let's just get one woman in every branch that we have in a village, right? So sometimes it's as small of a change, but it starts building, I think it starts a little bit of a movement internally, and the accountability that we were talking about just becomes a little bit more acceptable for organization and for different people across different departments and cadres to take. It's never easy. The resources are always limited. So as sort of, people who come in as DEI agenda consultants, we often see that, you're asked to sort of achieve the moon on behalf of the client with like super limited with pocket change often. And we still go around doing that to help them sort of decode what this means. And I was talking about the business and impact case, and I think that's another sort of tricky slope, treacherous slope that we encountered in our work, that we know that organizations, private sector organizations are definitely, and in healthcare as well, are very hyper attracted to the business case. But oftentimes that also becomes a bit of a tricky scenario because they will find the gaps. They will find the gaps in business case. Show me who in my space, in my context, is doing the same thing. Show me what's the standard global best practice or the Indian best practice from doing this, and I will do it. But there isn't. That best practice doesn't exist, right? So sometimes it's really about convincing the organization of how do you build your own accountability, your own standards, your own, little mini goalposts to start getting better, like get a little bit better than where you were at, do something more than what you were doing, make a little bit more effort. So oftentimes it's really that. And that we see helps. We, as an organization, we do work on a very sort of modular approach, doing right from gender diagnostic, a full sort of extensive diagnostic that takes super optimal resources from the organization, because we know that their resources and time are limited. And from that, we help them identify each gap area as an opportunity. This is your opportunity to do better. But we ask them to prioritize. We ask them to pick up the top 2 or 3 things that they want to tackle in a finite amount of time. And we break it into very achievable steps for them. It's not rocket science, but also something we see works and connects with the private sector clients specifically and partners. And in the context, sort of that understanding of context and looking at what might help for a specific organization. So no company wants to see just solutions being brought from outside. They want to be able to see that this is coming, this is a fit for purpose solution that works for them. And so bringing that participatory approach, being able to involve representation from across the organization, across the cadre of people that work there, both men and women, is also super important. It's not a women's issue we are here to solve. It's a healthcare sector issue that we're talking about. So how can we actually make it that and not make it a women's issue? Because I think one of you mentioned this earlier, right? We often see you walk into a meeting and you only see the women in the room when you're talking gender. And that's like the first barrier to sort of cross, and often the first hurdle we focus on getting the department heads and not just the women in the organization.
But isn't it a little bit ironic? I can't help sort of just being puzzled that in one way you say companies want a solution that is for them. It's about them, it's not generic, it's specific. Okay. But at the same time, I hear you also saying they're looking for the hole in the cheese. You didn't say that, but it's kind of what you said. They're looking for, okay, has anyone else done this? Does it work?
Yeah.
So I guess in the answer to has anyone else done this? Does it work? Is in a little bit of at least in attention with the other idea, which is we are a unique company. Our culture is very specific. You have to find a solution that will work for us. We can't just take something from the shelf of whatever company. No, it has to be for us. How do you how do you resolve that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like, I'm reminded of so many projects that we run sometimes where this becomes like almost like that first debate to resolve. I think what we start, the one approach that's worked for us is saying, okay, let's park all the things we don't know on one side and let's start looking internally within the organization. And so the diagnostic becomes a very important piece of like the whole puzzle of saying, what do your employees think? What do your team members think? And can we start unearthing the data around, is the thought process or are the answers or responses actually different between men and women? That's where the change starts. Leaders are almost always convinced that it wouldn't be, that they have gender blind or gender agnostic policies, and they don't discriminate, they don't have any biases, they train people right. But when the data comes out, I am yet to see in my 4 years at Rally for Women, I'm yet to see a data set that's emerged from any organization where the men and women perspectives are not significantly different. And that actually becomes like, it's almost like showing the mirror a bit, that here's the data, this is what's coming out from your own organization, this is anonymized, this is sex disaggregated. Let's start looking at what this tells us. Let's start seeing where the opportunity for change is, but frame it as an enabling conversation. We do often go back and say and look at the data that exists. Sometimes we're lucky to find, in some sectors, we're lucky to find that data, right? Like if you're working in, say, the banking sector, in clients in the banking sector, you may be able to find better data there because of the regulatory requirements. But in most other sectors, clean energy, et cetera, you don't always find that data. Healthcare, again, like that data is very patchy. So sometimes then it's really about saying, okay, we don't have that data, but there are some standards out there, global standards, but let's look at where the organization is at and forget the data. Like you should have 50%, at least 50% representation, but let's even forget it. Like you might have 3% representation in the organization. Can we agree by the end of this process that we'll take that 3% to 5%? Like, is that a nice goal to think? Or do you want to think about doubling this representation you decide the time period that you want to take, right? And I think that helps. So sometimes it's like, we're not holding you to best practices, the global standard, the regional state health sector standard, but you define what you think is actually going to be achievable. Let's move towards that target. And that has often helped. And so yes, it's not ideal, but it's a start. And if it's a, once they start, and we've seen sometimes it's like, those goosebump moments that happen on project calls when you end and you're about to wrap up, and then suddenly you hear the team talk about, oh, we didn't think this was going to be possible. Like we had an organization, a partner organization that said, we are going to hire one women in each of the rural branches we had. This is not in the healthcare space, but they thought it would take them about a year to get there. We got on our first project closeout call with them, which was 6 months into our work with them, and they had started getting there. And they were so excited. They were so excited, like no stopping them. We don't even play a role after that. We are out of that project post that. But they were so excited about seeing that change happen and seeing that was achievable. And I think that's the kind of aha moments you wait for in the work. And sometimes it works, right? Like if you make it more achievable for them.
Yeah. So what
Kalita, I want
hear
to come
you.
in here.
Yes, please. Yes, go.
The point you raise about the irony and also the angst of, all of us working in this. And I think Subhashri mentioned this from an allyship perspective, and obviously everything that Aprajita has said. But really, it is a litany of reasons not to do this, right? And sometimes I feel like, there is, of course, the economic argument, there's a business argument, but there's a justice argument as well, which has to be like, are you really saying that this is the data and you need reasons to be convinced to do this? Like, how are you going to, kind of really lock out 40% of the talent pipeline and be able to achieve anything? So I do feel like, and I think some of us are working that you're constantly trying to find that balance between being enablers, activists, and provocateurs, right? And I think at different points you need to be both. And, like I said, sometimes when I get up on the wrong side of the bed, you don't feel like being an enabler, and you're saying like, come on, right? Like I do think we need to strike the notes of being provocative in some of these conversations, because the fact is that we well, in fact, one of the things in the women's only leadership learning programs that we run, some of them, some talent custodians will tell me, but Shreyasi, actually our women are saying, our learners are saying that why do they need a cohort? Is this because they're not as good? Right? I said, listen, no man has ever asked, why are you putting you in a board where there are only other men, right? I said, at its very heart, it is still a leadership program. You learn the skill. But there's so much of, when happens, and I'm seeing this in a lot of the D&I conferences over the last 2 years that I've noticed this. This is almost, we're all almost apologetic about saying, oh, here we are talking about gender again. But I'm like, okay, it seems like there's a lot of noise because of all these, especially around March and Women's Day. But the fact is, the noise has convinced people that things have changed, but actually things have not changed. So I'm like, just because you think a lot is happening, nothing is. So there is, and I'm like, in how many things do you do in which you have perfect efficiency and effectiveness on ROI on every dollar spent, right? I tell them, listen, why are you getting, I've had these conversations with, why do you have a housekeeping person clean the office every hour on the hour? Is there an ROI from, your Lysol disinfectant spread? There are some things you need to do because they're also the right thing to do. And my thing always is do something, never do nothing. And let not good or progress or action, be compromised in this kind of pursuit of perfection when we're starting in such an imperfect place that almost anything you do is, going to help eventually. And nothing you do is going to show up in your quarterly board results. But that's the fact in something like this that you're doing.
It's a very interesting space where you could argue the pursuit of the perfect makes you it's an excellent excuse of doing nothing. So I really I like that. I think I know our time is running as always in these situations, and I wanted to get to just one last thing before we wrap up, which I think is we have sort of circled around it a little bit, which is how we've talked about hearts and minds, right, and how we need to talk to both, and I think. I mean, Sriyashi, you've talked very much also you've talked to both, but you've talked very much to the heart right now, as well as saying, hello, it's the right thing to do. Whereas you, Aparajita, have talked more to the mind, and so have you, Shubhashri. So we've had a very nice mix. I can't help thinking that there is a piece, and maybe it's more on the mind side, but I think it's interesting to just discuss for 4 minutes, which is if we want some measurements out there that help us see what progress is being made, what should they be? And you could say it's a banal question because, yeah, it's more women in leadership positions. And we've been talking about how little data exists and the problems there. But I can't help thinking that it's a bigger question than that, because I thought it was very inspiring, Avarashita, the way you were talking about change, that, you take what you can get and you move it and you move it and you move it. But that kind of change can be extremely hard to measure, at least in the short run. So there is this, how do we know that we're on track? Are we even on track? And what are small indicators versus big? So I wish just if you would share from your perspective, just some maybe short reflections on that, because I would love to hear from the three of you, ideas on this. How do we measure? Yeah, Aparajita, please.
Yeah, I think just a couple of very quick points. I think one is helping organizations, especially healthcare organizations, I think, because they are very much in the public eye. They're often involved in the public service as sort of public service organizations. The public commitments help, right? So how can we drive, how can we encourage, inspire them to take certain public commitments? And there are quite a few pledges, challenges, commitments, recognition, certifications, etc. to take, right? So some encouragement around that peer pressure works, that peer pressure inspires them, sends that message to not just to the outside world, but to also to employees and people working within those organizations, that this organization is committed to change or committed to care. And so that's one. The second is on the measurement piece, I think, is how do we make those metrics relatable and easier, and not something like, I think, as I was saying, not something which becomes an onerous process, but making the whole sort of integrating it within the organizational, sometimes the monitoring, evaluation, learning systems, or whichever way they are the dashboards, the business dashboards, the KPIs that they're measuring at the HR level, etc. How do we make it almost like, okay, you're doing this, also see how, for example, you're measuring employee satisfaction, look at how that differs between men and women. Sometimes that little change helps them take better decisions. So those two I would put as points and hand over to my co-panelists.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that, Shubhashri. I'm just
a couple of things that I would like to add as well. I think one of the key outcomes we are looking for is representation of women, especially in revenue generating, strategic roles with influence, and also in management and leadership roles. So you can measure success by looking at, is there an increase in this from what it was before we started all these initiatives. And I think it also becomes important to know that you need to have a critical mass of women representatives at management and leadership level for it to start making a difference, because a lot of times people feel satisfied with, I made a 2% increase from last year or 3% without thinking about the critical mass that starts to make a difference. And a lot of studies show us that you need to have at least 30% female representation to see significant benefits from having female leaders or managers. So I think it's important to set your goals and then measure whether you're getting there. I think that helps you to know whether you're being successful.
Yeah.
I think another way to look at it is, whether you're able to attract and retain minority groups. That also helps you to know whether your initiatives are a success, because then it tells you whether the entire workplace culture is changing as well, whether it's becoming more inclusive. So just a couple of points there that I thought that I would add.
Brilliant. Thank you. You can see I'm writing down. Finally, Shirashi, I would love to hear your quick thoughts on this as well.
So I think a very simple dashboard by levels representation, 40%, 60% keeps going up, and pay gap at each level, pay gap difference, right? You don't have to reveal your compensation slabs, which, everyone is so worried about always, but you can show it in percentages. I think as Prajita said, ENPS different for different genders. I think that's also very telling. And just a 3-year aggregated delta difference on these metrics. So, that over 3 years, if not year on year, it's tough. On 3 years, all of this. I think that tells me a lot if I can sort of get that data. And second, which would be great to have, is for this data to be just shared at the company level. I think I respect enterprises that say, of course, we're not perfect, like the world isn't. This is where we are. We hope to continue to make improvements on this. And you'll hear, and the CEOs to say, you'll hear from me every 2 quarters or every year with just kind of like a gender audit report that you could send on just one simple table.
Yeah, so not just an environmental sort of how much did we pollute this year, could also be how much did we actually progress on gender issues. Yeah, thank you. I in principle, I have 3 minutes to wrap up this conversation, and I know some of my dear colleagues at DASRA were asking me, do you want us to keep track of time so you're sure to get enough time at the very end? Here we are, no surprise, but I think, so first of all, I just want to thank the 3 of you for bearing with me and my questions and trusting that we would get somewhere. And I think your contributions have been excellent and really interesting and helped me think about the field and the work in front of us in new ways. That's why these panel discussions can be great. So thank you very, very much for that. I can see Yamini. I know when I see your face on the screen, it's a sign that we need to wrap up. So let me just say, I think the big takeaways are there is tons of work, and I can also hear that from the participants on the webinar. There's tons of work to do, both in terms of getting an alignment around what the problem is, but also what good solutions look like. There is a lot of expertise in the field, and I think the 3 of you represent that better than anyone. That it's not like we're starting from scratch. There's tons of knowledge and understanding of what works. And you 3 have been working on this for many years and have the collective wisdom just in this little group. And if we then were able to get everybody else to chip in, is massive. There's a lot to build on. And I think there's something extremely interesting about this idea that all the different things we can imagine all seem to be about chipping away at it. Getting commitment, getting leaders to be a little bit more ambitious than they thought they would be, to just, go a little higher, but also then helping them see that there is a path, show them the mirror. I love that image. I can just, yes, we all think we are excellent drivers. Well, maybe not everyone is better than everyone else. Can't be. And I think that also goes for gender equity in companies. They tend to overestimate their own success, and that's okay. It's human. But then taking them on that journey, understanding that these are the gaps, but also opportunities. These are things you can do something about. And then measuring that progress, the goals you set, measuring, keeping yourself accountable up against these goals going forward. I think that's the path, a difficult one, but thank you so much for your contributions. Yamini, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, just to say thank you to everybody. I wish we could have this for another hour or so. I think we've been like basically scratch the surface in the extent we can go down this pathway and discuss and unpack the issues. Thank you all so much. My really heartfelt gratitude to the audience and the panelists for taking time out of on a very busy day, middle of the week. Really appreciate it. And this will not be the only time you hear from us. We'll definitely be knocking on your doors again for more conversations, but also more sort of solution-based thinking. So with that, I want to thank my team, Anamika, Rini, Epshita, Sagar, Diego, Shelja, Nandika, Gauri, Tanya, everybody who's sort of part of the Women Lead Alliance team, the Red Associates team, for just putting this together, Ujwal, Heidi, and Millie, and Charlotta. Thank you all so much. And with 2 minutes over time, I'm going to wrap this meeting up.
Very much.
Thank you.